This is all the story of David, and we learn a lot about life through following the life of David. And I like the story that's 1 Samuel 29 through the end of the chapter. It's the end of Saul's life, and of course David was exiled away from Saul, and he could not live in Palestine because Saul tried to kill him. He threw a spear at him and all sorts of things. It just made it difficult for David, and he had 600 soldiers with him and their families and all their kids. And David went over and lived with the Philistines. I think that's the Palestinians today. Anyway, David went to live with the Philistines, and because they had some common enemies, the Amalekites and others, and so David's living with the Philistines and won the trust of the king, and the king made David and his soldiers his personal bodyguard. There's a lot of mistrust and a lot of assassinations and all kinds of stuff goes on in these countries. So he wanted David, who he felt was neutral, and to be his bodyguard, his personal bodyguard. So now it's time for the Philistines to go up against Israel. There's a dilemma. What does David do? But he had sworn his allegiance to the king of the Philistines. And so the king of Philistines says, "We want you to come with us, David. I will be back here behind my army, and you be with me, and take care of me, and you protect me with your men. My soldiers are out in front, and they're going to go fight against Saul and his sons and his armies." And so David says, "I'll do it. I'll be loyal to you, and I'll make sure that you're safe." Well, all the other generals under this king said, "Hey, wait a minute. This is the guy that they were singing songs about. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. What's going to happen with this guy and his 600 soldiers behind us, Saul and his army ahead of us, and all of a sudden David says, 'Hey, wait a minute, I'm an Israeli.'" And boom, they got a scissors on us. And so they said, "We don't want David to go along." So the king says, "Okay." And he gave in to the pressure of his generals and says, "David, you can't go along and fight with us." So David takes his 600 men and they go home. It took them 3 days to get home. When they get there, what had happened while they were gone, in that lapse of time, the Amalekites came and raided the town where David's people were, where all the soldiers' families were, where David's 2 wives were, and the Amalekites came and they took all those people. They didn't kill anybody, but they took everything, all his goats and sheep and camels and everything they had and the people, and they took off with them. David comes back with his army, and they get on the top of the hill and they see all the destruction. They had burned everything. Any buildings that they had put up, anything that was there, it was all burning, smoke and everything. And they started crying, and they were just really grieving and very distressed. And the soldiers said, "Let's stone David. Let's stone David. It's his fault. He took us away to be with the Philistines, and that made God mad. So we got to stone him." So there's David with all these soldiers of his own were his mighty men and his trusted men, were blaming him for the loss of their families, their children, their wives, for everything. So what does the verse say? Verse 30, chapter 30 of 1 Samuel, verse 6. But David found strength in the Lord his God. David is in a real difficult situation. He's about to be stoned. No one wants him to survive. They're all angry at him. And so, what does he do? What do we do when we're in a situation that doesn't have any out? When we're in a situation that we're grieving, we're crying, everything is wrong, and you don't know what to do. What David did, according to the Bible here, but David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David consulted the Lord. He went to Abiathar the priest, and he says, Abiathar, consult the stones on your sacred bib and see what we should do. And so Abiathar consulted the stones, he prayed to God, and he said, David, God says that if you pursue the Amalekites, you'll be able to restore everything. You'll be able to get everything back. So what's David have to do? He has to convince these men who know that this happened a while ago. The Amalekites had their family and wives. Maybe what kind of shape were those wives still in, and those babies, those children, the elderly people? He had to convince his men who were tired because they just came 3 days to get back home, walking. Convince them to go with him to get his people back. He was a pretty good leader. He convinced his men to go. So David and 600 men take out after the Amalekites. They came to a gorge, a big deep canyon, and 200 of the men, it was really difficult to get down and cross this gorge and come up the other side. And 200 of the men says, we can't do it. We are shot. We can't go any further. And so I imagine the 400 guys that still wanted to keep going, called them wimps and all sorts of things, but they stayed behind. David said, okay, you guys stay here and wait. We'll be back. So he, with the 400, went down in this canyon, scaled the wall on the other side, and kept going. And they found this Egyptian laying there in a field, out in the middle of nowhere, more dead than alive. And he hadn't eaten anything or drank anything, and here he is in the sun, dying. And it had been 3 days since he had anything to eat or drink. And the soldiers found him. They brought him to David. And David says, who are you? And he says, I'm an Egyptian. I was a slave. And my master saw that I was dying. I couldn't go any further. And so he just abandoned me here to die. And David says, would you show us where the Amalekites are? And the guy said, yeah, you're going to kill me. You guys will kill me. Swear that you won't kill me, and I'll show you. So they gave him water, they gave him food, and they helped him get strong, and the next morning they set out. And this Egyptian showing them where the Amalekites were. They came up on this hill, this long slope, and they're standing up there on the ridge, and they look down the other side, and there's the Amalekites. Their families and their wives and all their stuff were in a big circle, and the Amalekites had them circled, and they were out there drinking and getting drunk and eating and singing and dancing and everything because they had all this plunder that they had captured. So David says, there they are, men, let's go. And they started running down the hill. And they killed the Amalekites. They wiped them out except for 400 young men escaped on camels. And they got away. But they didn't pursue them. They got to their families, they hugged their wives and their children, and everybody was safe. Nothing happened. They were not hurt in any way. And then the Bible says they restored everything. Not a thing was lost. The Amalekites evidently had just taken them, and they haven't even spent any or eaten up any of the food or killed the goats or anything yet. And so they restored everything, got everything back. So now the guys are all happy, the 400 men, and with the wives of the other 200 and all their children and everything, and they start back. This took about 18 hours because they fought all day long and into the next morning. And so they guys were really exhausted now. You think 3 days coming here, then catching up with these guys, the Amalekites, crossing that big canyon and everything. And now they've got their families. Everything, nothing is lost. Everything is gotten back, and they start on their way back. They get to the canyon. They go down the canyon. They cross the bottom, up the other side, and helping the little kids and the elderly people. Everybody gets out on the other side, and the 200 men there see their wives and children, and they run out and they hug them. Everybody's happy. Everybody's happy. They're all together again. But then the 400 guys said, hey, wait a minute. These guys didn't go along and help us get that stuff back. They can have their wives and children, none of the plunder. They can't have anything else. And David says, hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute. Somebody had to stay here and take care of our things. We couldn't get everything down across that canyon. These guys did their job. They were tired. Share and share alike. Everybody gets an equal share. And so everybody was happy, and they go back to where they were living. And nothing, the Bible repeats, nothing at all was lost. I think that's a pretty cool story. It shows, see, I made a little list. What kind of leader was David? What do you think?
A good one?
He was a good leader. He was an excellent leader.
He was a very wise one.
What's that?
He was very wise.
He was very wise. Those are two good words. Good leader, wise leader, what else?
He was a strong leader.
The what?
A strong leader.
He was a strong leader. That's the first thing I have down.
He's godly.
He was a godly man. He consulted God. So many people, when things like that are really bad, they fall apart. And they think, what do I do? What can I do? And they try and figure things out for themselves. And I like how David found strength in the Lord his God, and the first thing he did was consulted the Lord. He consulted his God. What else did David do as a leader?
He was fair.
Extremely fair.
He was a peacemaker.
He was a peacemaker.
He went forward, he didn't go back.
He went forward. He did not go back.
He was obedient to the Lord.
I put the word understanding along with fair. He was fair and understanding. He was able to put himself into other men's positions. How do you think those guys felt when they had absolutely no strength left to go after their wives and children that they loved? and they just couldn't go anymore.
They probably felt horrible.
I bet they did feel horrible. But David understood. He was fair and so forth like that. He defended those followers who were not strong. The Bible says something else, and I'm not sure I pointed it out. But the Bible says that from that time forward, that was a precedent. That always there were men who stayed behind to guard things. And those men shared and shared alike with the guys who went out and fought. And that was a precedent that's set to this day. Our armies have men who are back with the sick and the wounded, and with the tanks and with the munitions, with the food, with all the supplies and everything, and they're all one army. They're considered equal. What else do you think? One thing that I forgot to include in the story was when they got back to their own homes, David took gifts, and he sent gifts from the things that he got from the Amalekites, because they had raided other places too, so they came back with a lot of stuff. And he sent, it gives a list here, about more than 10 places, I believe, where he sent gifts to the leaders of those towns. What was he doing?
To the leaders of which towns?
The Israelis. Saul was gone now. That's part of the story too. Saul gets killed by the Philistines in that battle with the Philistines. So now the country does not have a king. And David gets back with all his people, with all the booty and everything that he captured. And he sent gifts to the elders of all those cities back in Israel. What do you think he was doing?
Making peace with people?
He's thinking ahead.
He was thinking ahead. He was making peace. Yeah. He was showing them, hey, I will be fair with you guys. I will take care of you people. We're not your enemy. We're not enemies. And some people might say that was politicking. But what he was doing was showing that he wanted to be fair and treat everyone alike. And he was willing to take care. And so he gave gifts to the people that stayed, the leaders of the towns that stayed back, that were there in their land. What do you think?
I thought it was a good story.
I think it's a great story. I love that story. It shows a lot of character. One of the things that he as a leader was able to do was actually change the temperament of the men that followed him. Here they wanted to kill him. Now they were talked into going with him. And he was standing there by himself, alone. And but he consulted God, consulted the men of God, the priest, and he was able to change the temperament of his people. Pretty good.